I'm Andrew Joseph Keith. I'm an artist and sculptor, and in this video I wanted to walk you guys through the tools that I use for my abstract style of stone sculpting. These are the tools that I used to take this limestone rock that I found in the yard and turned it into this sculpture titled The Queen. So if that sounds interesting, let's go ahead and get into it. First off, if you're going to be doing some stone sculpting, you need a space to carve. This is a garage. It's just a place I can make a lot of dust, because stone carving, you're going to make a lot of dust, especially with the tools that I'm going to be using. So I'll usually do it either outdoors or in a space where I'm okay if pretty much every surface is just covered in stone dust. Next is safety equipment. So I use earmuffs. I usually also have a set of headphones that I'm listening to podcasts or other things, because I like to listen to things while I work. And then a respirator and some eye protection. Now this is an old respirator. I now have a newer one, but it's an N95 respirator. You can find these at hardware stores for like paint and things like that. You want to have one of these to keep you from breathing in all of that stone dust, things that you don't want to be breathing in, and so having a respirator is really important. And I'll put links to the things that I talk about in this video in the description, either affiliate links or tag the materials through YouTube. But if you can find cheaper versions of any of these, I don't blame you for making sure you're getting the best deal. I'll sometimes do that. But of course, if you use the affiliate links or the tag products, that helps me out, and I appreciate anybody that does that. So the primary tool that I use for almost all of the sculpting is a 5-inch variable speed angle grinder. Now the brand I have is Makita. You want to make sure that it is variable speed, and that's because of the different tools that I use. Some of those you have to have a slower speed, so having a variable speed one is important. Though the brand, I don't know if it matters as much, though I'm sure there will be people with opinions in the comments of what the best brand is, so I'd be curious what you guys think. This is just the one that I've been using, and it's worked great so far. Occasionally you'll need to replace the brushes on the inside, and that's pretty straightforward. I've done that a few times. But this is what I use for cutting and grinding the sculpture down to the basic shape that I want. Now, this works really well for kind of these abstract forms that I use and the line work that I do for more simplified sculptures. For more realistic sculptures, the tool set will be a little bit different. So these tools are specifically for the more abstracted, smooth planes, smooth surface with sharp angles and kind of flowing line work throughout the sculpture. And then on that angle grinder, the primary sculpting tool is this cutting and grinding blade that I have. This is a diamond blade that has the diamonds attached to the surface of the blade. This one works really well for cutting and grinding marble, limestone. Works really well for those, but harder stones like granite, they can kind of remove these diamonds. And so for that, you want a sintered blade. But this is what I primarily use because I like sculpting in marble and limestone. Really important that you be able to get a flat surface. This is what I use to flatten the bottom of the sculpture and other things. So make sure that whatever tool you use, it has the attachment that allows this to be a flat, flush plane. So with this, I'll usually make cuts into the sculpture and then use a hammer to hit away and break off those pieces. And then as I get closer to the surface, I'll use this flat part to grind away and get closer and closer to that finished surface that I want on the sculpture. So when I'm doing a stone sculpture, I'd say about 90 to 95% of the material that I remove it with this diamond blade. Now they do have different versions of these. There's many different kinds. The one that I showed you is one that I got on the website 2, the number 2, Sculpt.com, and it's a little bit more expensive, but it works really well and it's lasted a long time. This is a cheaper version that I got, and it works okay, but it doesn't have as many diamonds on the surface, and I use the grinding feature quite a bit. And so I'll put a link to the ones that I can find. So this is an example of the fitting that I don't recommend. This is what they typically come with. You use these to twist it onto the angle grinder, but then sometimes it doesn't allow you to get that flush, flat surface because the bit kind of sticks out a little bit. So if you can, I recommend finding the one that's flush that allows you to screw it directly onto the angle grinder without having to use these other parts. There are also sintered blades, and so those ones, the diamonds are put directly into the metal of the blade, and those are better for harder stones. So if you're doing granite or something that will wear down these other tools really fast, then you want to use a sintered blade. For the more detailed areas, sometimes it helps to have a set of metal burrs. I use these quite a bit in the queen stone sculpture to work out the details around the eyes and nose and mouth. And you can use these metal burrs on a die grinder, or this is a Makita hand drill that kind of allows that same angle so that you can hold it this way and the bit is coming off to the side. But I have this on a handheld drill. These come in all sorts of shapes. This one's a good one for just kind of general sculpting in those inside areas, those concave areas. And then for hand tools, I recommend a set of files. These are machine files that I got from Harbor Freight. And I think Harbor Freight allows you to return the files if you wear them out. I think they have a lifetime warranty, at least they did when I purchased these. And these can really help when you're trying to refine the details and get the surface really smooth and work on that line work. I really like to use these by hand to work on those finishing touches and get it closer to that smooth surface that I want. So a good set of machine files is important for that. I also sometimes like to use stone rasps. Here's an example of one of those rasps. This one I also got on the website tosculpt.com. It's not sponsored or anything, but I've worked with the owner of that. Miles likes helping out sculptors with stone and tools. So if you're interested, that website's a great resource. And these rasps are made in Italy, and they're pretty high quality and durable stone rasps that work really well for working in those inside areas that are difficult to do with other tools. Once the design's close to being finished, then I can start sanding. And for that, what I like to use are these sanding pads that are for wet or dry sanding. And so these are masonry sanding pads, and they start at 50 grit and go up to, I think, like 3,000 or something like that. So if you're going for a polish, you'd go all the way up to the 3,000, and then you would use a polishing compound and a polishing wheel, which I'll show you. These are really helpful. I like to get the ones that are wet or dry so that I don't have to be feeding water to the sculpture, so I can use just a normal angle grinder. I don't have to have an attachment to be wet sanding, which is more complicated. And so all you need for that is a backing pad that fits onto that angle grinder, and then you have to reduce the speed to as slow as it'll go. And then these just have Velcro on one side, and then the sanding pad just fits on those, and you can sand with those. They have backing pads that are foam backing pads. They're kind of a firm foam, and they also have metal ones if you want a more rigid backing, but I mostly use the foam ones. You'll be able to sand, but you have to be careful when you're sanding with an angle grinder. It's hard to find the forms and get them really perfect with an angle grinder, which is why hand sanding is a more accurate way to go about it. For hand sanding, what I like to use are these sanding pads, and I like these because I feel like they last a little bit longer, and I can use them wet or dry. So I can dry sand with them by hand. You can also put it onto an actual sander, and sometimes I'll have little smaller ones, and these have a little bit of firmness to them so that I can use them to work on the inside areas, and it has a little bit of a backing. And again, you'll usually start with rougher grit, like a 50 grit, and then work your way up 100, 200, 400. For the female queen sculpture, I just went up to, I think, 220 with wet sanding. So once you've done some of the sanding to about 150 dry, then you want to switch to wet sanding, and what that does is it creates a little bit of what's called a slurry, or kind of a mud. The dust from the stone mixes with the water as you're wet sanding, and that allows you to get a much smoother sanding. And for that, they also have these types of sandpaper that are specifically for wet sanding. If I'm going to be hand sanding up to, let's say, 1,500 or 3,000, then I'll be wet sanding to create that slurry and that smooth surface. And what you want to do is you want to sand it and then dry it off, and as the stone is drying, the scratches from previous grinding or files or sandpaper will show up as it's drying, and that allows you to mark those up and then make sure that you get rid of all of the previous marks before you move on to the next grit of sandpaper That's really important because if you don't get rid of the larger scratches, then you won't be able to get rid of them with a finer sandpaper. It'll take forever. So then once that's all done, then we're going to use a die grinder with a little cloth bit and some polishing compound. Now this is what I use if I'm doing let's say a dark stone sculpture that I want to bring to a polished finish. Here's an example of one of those. This is a sculpture called Sculpting in black Utah marble. I used some polishing compound, this cotton cloth bit that's for polishing, on a die grinder, and was able to polish that up to make it look really nice. While I'm editing this, I realized that I forgot to mention that I also have a hammer drill and a set of hammer chisels that are for masonry or for stonework. And that's what I use to drill a hole up the bottom of the sculpture as well as into the base. And then I take a threaded metal rod and epoxy it into the base of the sculpture. And then I'll countersink a little bit on the bottom of the stone base. And that allows me to attach the sculpture to the base with a bolt and make sure that everything is nice and secure and that the sculpture stays on the base when it's displayed. Now that's a lot of tools. If I could recommend just starting with one thing, it would be the angle grinder that's variable speed, the diamond blade, and the sanding backer with some dry sanding discs. You can get a lot done with just those tools, especially in this more abstract style. Once the stone is finished and all polished, then I'll use a stone sealer. For darker stones, I'll use a seal and enhance that allows the stone almost to get the look of stone when it's wet a little bit, so it brings out the colors a little bit more. If it's a lighter stone like a white marble, then I'll just use a normal sealer. And here's the brand that I use. I think I found this at Home Depot, and it was recommended to me by my instructor in college who does a ton of stone sculptures, and he really likes this. The sealer works pretty well to protect the stone from harm from any stains or anything like that. Now you'll notice that I didn't go over chisels. Chisels are great, especially if you're doing more realistic stone sculpting, and so I'll probably do a separate video where I go over that. But for more abstract styles, I found that these cutting and grinding system works really well. So those are all the tools that I use. Again, you can find links to those. If you're interested in my sculpting courses, which are more realistic, traditional sculpting in clay, there's a course on figure sculpting fundamentals, how to sculpt people, a course on portraiture, and a course on the hands. Those are a great resource to anybody interested in learning traditional sculpting. I think it's a great thing to be a part of, fun and enjoyable, and something that I really like doing, and I like sharing it with you guys. So thank you to anybody that gets those courses. As always, I hope you can stay creative, stay productive, and hopefully I'll see you again soon in another video.